Welcome back into Play-by-PlayCast. It is the second episode since our rebirth as a podcast. Everybody waiting 4 long years for episode 194, I think this is. Welcome back into the Play-by-PlayCast, podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. I will say it is much more awkward doing the intro while the person you're about to have on the show is staring at you, because I used to record these after the fact. So we'll have to shrink this up on future episodes. But Drew Carter is our guest, voice on television for road games, for now, of the Boston Celtics and also of ESPN. Drew, thanks for coming by.
Joel, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. I was not staring at you. I was staring at your beautiful Syracuse lacrosse banner in the background. That's what I was looking at, I promise.
2008 national champs, baby.
We got to get back to the summit, man. I think Gary's the guy, but it might take a couple more years.
You would hope so. But did you call? So for people that don't know, Drew went to Syracuse, graduated in 2019.
Yep.
Correct. Did you call anything awesome when you were in college?
Ooh. Anything. I mean, wow. Multiple things. So,
well, I mean, like best game. Did you get like a great NCAA tournament experience?
Yeah. So we'll get into this as we talk about, my journey to this point, but my whole life and career has been one big stroke of luck. So senior year, we had an awesome class. Like my best friends in the world to this day are still the guys I graduated with. Our football team won 10 games. And that was the one winning season Dino Babers had in 7 years until this past season when he got fired. Our basketball team was good, not great. A bubble team made the tournament, lost in the first round, but we did go to Duke and beat them at Cameron when they had Zion Williamson, RJ Barrett, and Cam Reddish. That was an overtime game, called it with Noah Eagle. Lacrosse was sort of similar, didn't have a great team, didn't have a great finish to the season, but some cool moments as well. But yeah, we just got mad lucky. We got wicked lucky, I should say, now that I'm a Boston resident with the events we got to call.
You have to put the accent on it. Like wicked lucky.
Wicked lucky kid. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your path if we want to dive right in. Voice on television of the Celtics, taking over for Mike Gorman, or transitioning with Mike Gorman for this year. Prior to that, or I guess still like concurrently with ESPN, right?
Yeah, technically full-time with both. Okay. Yeah.
But before that, you were in television in Alabama, 2 years of local news. Timely, actually, like I'm like cutting my own questions off in my head. Best Nick Saban story, because he just retired.
So I asked Nick Saban, I think, one question in a press conference, because the thing with Alabama football is it's everything down there. To me, the reason they say it just means more in the Southeast is because nothing else matters. So it actually means the most, it's the number one thing. Like I always say, you might as well have on your driver's license which team you root for in the state of Alabama. It's your height, your weight, your eye color, Alabama or Auburn. That's how.
And Troy.
Yeah, exactly. Troy. Yeah, sure. UAB, Samford, if you really, want to get in the weeds. But anyway, it's so important. So anyway, there's so many people at those press conferences asking questions. I never really felt the need to, put on my Dan Rather hat and, ask a hard hitter. But I did ask him a question once where they were playing Tennessee. And at that point, Jeremy Pruitt was the coach at Tennessee. Excuse me, I'm a little under the weather today. But Jeremy Pruitt was the coach. And at that point, Nick Saban, he had assistants at half the SEC schools. So the previous week, they had played Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M. Now they're playing Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee. And last week, someone had asked him, what's your favorite memory of coaching on the same staff as Jimbo Fisher? And he had said, playing noontime basketball. It wasn't like this meeting about, how to dial up a pressure or this celebration of a national championship. It was playing basketball at noon. So the following week, I'm like, great idea. I'm going to ask if he ever played noontime basketball with Jeremy Pruitt. It was the first time I'd ever asked him a question, though. So I'm nervous. My heart is pounding. You would think that going to Syracuse, I'd have some experience asking potentially curmudgeon-y coaches who don't like the media questions, but I was still really nervous. And so the way they do it is they have a microphone that gets passed around. The TV people are in the back, and the print writers are sort of in the front. And so it's toward the end of his question session, and the microphone comes back to me, and I can literally see my heart beating through my shirt. I was that nervous. And I get the mic, SID points at me, and I go, "Did you ever play noontime basketball with Jeremy Pruitt?" I was so nervous, like I could barely even get through it. And Saban looked at me like I had four heads. And I was so nervous. I'm like, I'm about to get roasted, and this is going to be everywhere, and I'm going to sound like an idiot, and Nick Saban's going to have another viral clip. He looks at me, he's like, "What?" And then he looks over at the SID, Josh. Thankfully, Josh heard the question and translated it. And Nick Saban actually laughed. Like he thought it was funny. And that, to this day, is one of my proudest moments that I made Nick Saban smile.
That's a great story. That's
Well,
perfect.
see, and here's the thing, Joel. Like, I think people have this misconception, and clearly so did I, about Nick Saban. I really don't think he hates the media.
No, they just don't
Um,
like doing media. But like if you get them the right way, then
yeah.
yeah.
Well, they don't like doing it because, I mean, Nick Saban, more than maybe anybody, has a one-track mind. It seems like the only thing he cares about is football. But I think if you ask a smart, well thought out question, and you don't make any assumptions in the question,
Yeah.
then you're not going to get ripped. But like a Saban or a Boeheim or a Belichick or a Popovich, when you try to sound like the smartest person in the room while asking your question, that's where you're going to get in trouble. Like Rick Carlisle, I think, is kind of similar to that. So we were in Indy a couple days ago, and some guy asked a pretty long, meandering question that started with, a couple of the players were talking about how you told them they need to have a better attention to detail and blah, 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 blah. And Rick goes, "Who said that? What are you talking about? Who said that?" And he's like, "I think it was Buddy and Benedict Math or something like that." And it's like, at a certain point, it's a good lesson. I think it's something we probably both learned at Syracuse, Joel, is you got to be quick with your question. There's no need to prove to everybody how smart you are. You don't need to couch everything for 30 seconds. Just ask the question. That's what Boeheim would say. If you have a question, I'll answer it. What's your question?
Yeah.
Don't yell a statement at me and expect me to respond to it.
Um, Now I feel like I need to respond with like the world's crispest, cleanest question ever.
Mhm.
No pressure.
Don't make it a yes or no.
I was
Make it open-ended.
I'm actually just gonna make a statement and ask for your thoughts.
Mhm.
When you were in television at Alabama, though, I know play-by-play has always been your dream, your want, your desire. What did you get professionally from a developmental standpoint that helped towards what you do now because you were on live television every single day?
Yeah, so a couple things with that. Number one, from a professional standpoint, I feel like I grew a lot because at Syracuse, there was a lot of focus on the air, right? There wasn't like at Citrus TV, I never produced News Live at 6. And when we were doing classes with our capstone and stuff, we'd build a rundown, but it wasn't like you were really producing stuff. At least not in my experience. When I got to Alabama, anytime I anchored the sports block, we would produce it, we'd stack the rundown, we'd write it, we'd edit the video, we'd make the graphics ourselves in our internal system there. And it was a lot of stuff behind the scenes that people don't ultimately see. All they see is, me talking on camera. And I think that made me way better for multiple reasons. Number one, when something is like your baby, I just feel like the end result is going to be better. Because I produced all of it, I knew exactly why each slug was in there. I knew why each line was in the script. I felt like it all made sense. I felt like it flowed. And I thought as a result, I became better on the air. And I think more importantly, when you do a variety of different roles, you understand everything that goes into it. So now doing the Celtics games or calling a game at ESPN or hosting in studio, I feel like I'm not going to make a ridiculous, outlandish request. Hey, can we edit this? Hey, can we get the video of the 1978 semifinals from March Madness at at 6:15 left in the first half. There's this one clip that I think could really tell this story. It's like, and oh, by the way, we're on the air in 15 minutes. All right, let's see if we can find that. There are certain things that you realize, you just understand how difficult certain tasks are. And you start to learn that like the job of going on and reading the script or calling the game is not the hardest job and not the most important job in my opinion, because ultimately people want to see what's happening. And same thing as graphics and local news or the highlights in local news. So I learned that professionally. I feel like that made me a lot better. But I actually think in 2 years in Alabama, I grew more personally than professionally, which is not to say I don't think I improved down there. But I think when you're at Syracuse, it's you're sort of in a bubble in the sense that everyone who goes there is there for a very specific purpose. Everyone there wants to be great. And when you get into the real world, I think there's a tendency, at least this is how I felt, to think that, okay, now I'm a professional. I'm going to be surrounded by people who have the same, level of determination. They're going to work as hard as I do. They want it to be great as badly as I do. And you get to the professional world and realize that for a lot of people, it's just a job, which is there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not like a passion project like it is for every kid who goes to Syracuse. And when I was in school, I mean, I was like the quintessential broadcast nerd. I think I went to 2 games as a fan in my 4 years at Syracuse. I was either calling it or reporting on it or making a tape at it. Like, I think when Jason Tatum came to Syracuse when he was at Duke, I was in the top level making a play-by-play tape to try to get cleared at WAER. I had like, and I think as grateful as I am for that, and as much as I wouldn't change anything, I sort of do feel like that might have stunted my growth as a person because I didn't really have the traditional college experience. You know what I'm saying? So when I got to the real world in Alabama, it was like my first chance to be a normal human being after leaving home. And I feel like that really forced me to grow up.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting the perspective when you talk about learning all the roles, learning all the jobs, learning what goes into everything. Because a couple interviews that I've heard you do since you took over for the Celtics, and whenever you talk about games, you've called them shows.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's television. Like we are producing television shows, but to call it a show is an interesting turn of phrase because a show has components and a show tells a story that is well thought out in advance. And obviously there's an improv aspect to it because the game is happening in an untold fashion. But how do you now look at structuring play-by-play and structuring games and working with your producer and your analyst and your sideline reporter to kind of attack a cohesive story every night? Do you take a similar tact?
Yeah, I think it's a fine line, Joel, because I mean, you know this as well as anybody. Like you said, you have to react organically to what's happening, and you have to be ready to, throw out the rundown, as it were, and just talk about what's happening in front of you. Mike Gorman, the guy I'm following with the Celtics, he tells a story about his first Celtics game ever. He was working with Tommy Heinsohn, legendary player, Mr. Celtic, who called Celtics games for decades and was beloved here. And Mike had all these notes. He spent hours and hours prepping, and he might have been a little nervous his first game. And it's right before the game. He's going through his notes, and Tommy looks over at him and he goes, "What's all that? Can we swear on this
Yeah,
podcast?
yeah, by all means.
What's that bullshit?" Mike's like, "It's my notes. It's my prep for the game." Tommy takes all the notes, picks up the stacks of paper, and throws it over the railing. And Mike's like freaking out, like, "Why would you do that? That's all my prep. Like, and what am I gonna do now?" Tommy's like, "We're gonna watch what happens and we're gonna talk about it." So I think to a certain extent, you do need to be ready to do that and just say, I had all these ideas. The game dictated that we're not going to talk about it, so we're not going to do it. But at the same time, if you think about how we're wired, people love a story. There's a reason so many people in our business, Joel, call themselves storytellers. I think at our core, that's what we all are. So you have to tell the story of the teams, the players, and of the game. And, to me, I think back to when I was, a kid watching sports and, even to this day. And I realize one of the best feelings as a sports fan watching a game is when you feel like you've seen a fully realized story. And part of the way the announcers can do that is by introducing you to an interesting character who has a cool background, or maybe has, taken his game to a new level this year, or maybe has some family in the audience because he's playing close to home, something like that. And then if you get to the end of the story and that person is the hero, all of a sudden, that's where the magic happens to me. That's why I call it a show. And I got really good advice from Bill Roth, who's another Syracuse guy who's given advice to a ton of us. And when I first started at ESPN, I was struggling with how to prep effectively, because you can spend 40 hours prepping for a college football game, but it's not going to be productive if you don't have a specific goal in mind. If you have, six different notes on the third string defensive tackle, but you don't have the kicker's career long, you've wasted your time, because you need to know what's going to be relevant pretty much every time you're doing a broadcast. I was like, Bill, I feel like I'm just prepping the wrong stuff. He goes, remember, you're prepping for a show, not just a game. And it's different, I think, in TV versus radio, where in radio, you know, you're basically talking the entire time. So you need to have more stuff. With that being said, like, you're describing more of the action, so it's not necessarily as much background info. But in radio, I always felt like I was prepping for a game, whereas in TV, we're prepping for a show. And you have to think about how you're going to come in and out of elements, go to break, come back from break, cap everything at the end. And it's really involved. So I always think about it in terms of what we're presenting to the viewer, as opposed to just how am I digesting this game.
You talked about Mike and advice that he's given you, and you're in the unique situation because you guys are both doing the job simultaneously.
Yeah.
So it's not just he's gone and it's you. Everybody, I'm sure you've been asked a million times, how do you replace a legend? Like, how do you follow in his footsteps? But what's your relationship like with Mike in terms of um, being able to replace him in a way that, like, you're learning from him, you're getting to know him, you're doing the same job. So he's calling one game, you're calling the next game. And like being a voice of the Celtics as opposed to just two guys who are dropping in and calling the game.
Yeah, it's a great question, Joel. I've thought about it a ton. I actually went out with Mike, Scal, and Mike's wife, Terry, last night after the game, which is why I'm sick. No, just kidding. We weren't out that late, but we went out, grabbed a beer at this place, like a few steps from the garden. Mike has been incredible to me, and I'm trying to, every time I discuss this, I make it a point to say I'm following Mike. I'm not replacing Mike or succeeding Mike. The verb is follow, because there will never be another Mike Gorman. I know that. And in a way, that's sort of liberating, because I'm not going to try to be him. Nobody can. And it does make it a little bit awkward this year, though, because for the fan, I think it might be a little bit jarring. It's like a lot of people might not realize what's going on this year. They still might not understand. Like, for some games, it's Mike. For some games, it's Drew. I'm still kind of confused. I don't want it to be jarring for people to flip on a road game and have me talk 10 times more than Mike does, But ultimately, Mike and I do the job differently. So I'm trying to balance being myself and being authentic with, doing right by Mike and not making it a harsh transition for the fans. So I've thought about this a lot. And the key thing is, number one, Mike has been amazing and super gracious. I think it could have been easy for him to see that I was the one following him and be like, who the fuck is this guy? Like, Mike has been calling Celtics games almost twice as long as I've been alive. And I'm not from here. He's from Dorchester. He's lifelong Celtics fan. Worked with Tommy Heinsohn. The guy's an OG. And I call him that sometimes. Like, what's up, OG? Do you want to grab a drink post game? The guy is like the voice of the Celtics. And for him to have that title, by the way, is remarkable, because Johnny Most is one of the biggest legends in sports broadcasting, and he was the voice of the Celtics. So I know, like, the prestige of this job and the history of this job, and those things aren't lost on me. And so I just appreciate how kind Mike has been every step of the way. Because he never, as far as I know, had that reaction at all. He actually says he was happy that he didn't know the person, following him before the announcement. I think he knew he'd gotten a heads up, but we didn't have a relationship before I got here. And I think he said he was happy about that because now we get a chance to develop this organic thing. And we both get to make a friend. We get to lean on each other sort of, and I get to ask him for advice. And it's been really cool. The other key part of that is the producer and director have been doing this for 20 plus years each, Paul Lucy and Jim Edmonds, and they're two of the best I've ever worked with in their respective jobs, and they're still here. And like we talked about earlier, Joel, I think the producer and director, in my opinion, are a lot more important for the show's success than the play-by-play guy. That's for sure. So the fact that they're still there sort of takes some of the pressure off me and makes it a lot easier. And now we can just go out there and have fun. But I will say I was very anxious at the start because, like I said, I know how important this job is. I know how much the broadcast means to people. Think about the Mike and Tommy show. The local broadcast is important everywhere, but I feel like especially in Boston, just because people felt like they knew those guys. And Mike's been doing it for so long. Every time I'm with Mike, whether it's at the Garden or anywhere else, 10 different people say, I grew up with you. And it's like, oh my God, holy shit, that's a lot of pressure for the next guy.
That's
you
me.
know?
Yeah.
Right. So, but it's also really exciting. And I think what Mike's kindness has allowed me to do is reframe that from a lot of pressure to a really cool opportunity. And so now we're just having a lot of fun. I hope the fans are too.
What's the best part about being in the NBA?
Probably the Equinox, that is the hotel gym at the San Francisco hotel.
You're just you're living a different life right now, aren't you?
It's ridiculous, dude. It's ridiculous. For those who don't know, the collective bargaining agreement between the players and the teams essentially states that the teams have to stay in the nicest hotels possible. So here we are. I'm content with a Hampton Inn and Suites. That's where we typically stay. That's the level we're talking about at ESPN. You put me in a Courtyard Marriott, I'm like, that's awesome. Perfect. By the way, Marriott is the correct way to pronounce the hotel chain, not Marriott. Everyone gets it wrong, right? And I learned that when they sponsored the NFL draft and all the billboards said, brought to you by Marriott. Is that the right way to say it? Yes, it is.
That was a good impression, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I was cool with the Marriott the whole time. And I still am. But now we're staying in the Four Seasons and the Ritz, and it's insane. And it's I walk in there, I'm like, I don't belong here. This is crazy. Jason Tatum, yeah, this is your hotel, dude. But me, I should be down the street. I should be at a Holiday Inn.
I'll walk to the bus. Yeah.
Yeah. But so that's really, really cool. In all seriousness, though, we have a security guy, our head of security with the Celtics on the road, who is you think about a security guy, and this dude fits the archetype to a T. Stoic, doesn't smile very much, usually dressed in all black, awesome guy who takes great care of us, but not exactly the most bubbly dude. And I saw him getting on the team flight about a week ago. I'm getting on the plane, walking up the stairs, and there's Jim, our security guy. And he goes, well, he wears a suit for the home game, so he had changed, and he was wearing his athleisure. I'm like, Jim, you changed, looking good, man, love it. He's like, why are you so happy all the time? Why are you always smiling? And I'm thinking about it. I'm like, why am I? Because I'm not always like that, but every time I'm around him, I am. And the answer is being in the NBA is the coolest thing ever. You walk into these arenas, there are 20,000 people there. A lot of them are dressed in green because the Celtics have great fans and they travel well. And maybe it'll wear off, Joel, but at this point, every time I'm on the plane or I'm in the arena or I'm calling the game, I'm just on top of the world because I still can't fully wrap my head around the idea that I'm traveling with the Celtics and calling these games. It's just really cool.
Who'd you grow up a fan of?
Well, it's funny you ask because we beat the Timberwolves last night, and that's my team. Or at least it used to be when I was growing up in Minnesota. I have my phone case is Kevin Garnett and Randy Moss. So I'm wearing a Vikings hat. I was
Kevin
Minnesota
Garnett's the right
guy.
guy. Anything's possible. They'll love him here.
Yes, correct. And Randy Moss also had his
That's
best
true.
season in Boston after leaving
True.
Minnesota. So hopefully I can follow in those guys' footsteps and succeed after going from Minnesota to Boston.
Um, how did you become, what have you done to know everything you ever could possibly need to know about the Boston Celtics?
A lot of YouTube videos. I watch old Celtics games like they're movies, which I guess sort of ties back into the show aspect we were talking about. Like game 7 of the 2010 finals. Oh yeah, watch. I highly recommend anybody watches that game because it's amazing. It's an amazing time capsule of, what it was like back then. And speaking of 2010, that same year, Joe Mazzulla, now the head coach of the Celtics, was playing at West Virginia at the time. They upset Kentucky in the Elite Eight. Kentucky had DeMarcus Cousins, Eric Bledsoe, John Wall, Patrick Patterson. They were stacked. They were the 1 seed. And Joe Mazzulla in West Virginia, Bob Huggins was the coach. They threw this 1-3-1 kind of junky zone at them and ended up beating them. Reason that was relevant is because the Celtics played a bunch of zone against the Pacers last weekend. And someone on social media made the connection. Drew Holiday, the technically smallest guy on the floor for the Celtics, was sort of playing the big man role in our 2-1-2. And Joe Mazzulla, the smallest guy on the floor for West Virginia, was sort of doing the same thing in that Elite Eight game. So I went back and I watched that broadcast, and it's amazing. Dick Enberg and Jay Billis are on the call. Mentioned all the guys from Kentucky. Bob Huggins is coaching West Virginia. So stuff like that, I think, it sort of has happened organically where just talking to people in and out of the organization, I've I've kind of dived into the history of the team, and that's, ancient history, like all the way back to the original Celtics and then the Bill Russell and Tommy Heinsohn days, and then more recent history like Isaiah Thomas's 50-point game after his sister passed away. Stuff like that. I think for me it's happening in a way that it's not like I'm, locking myself in my apartment and reading the story of every season of the Celtics. It's more just talking to people and then making a note on something and then going and researching it later. So I sound like I've been here for as long as Mike has.
Walk me through how you got to Boston. Um, I think people would say, "Oh, he was here, right? Like he was working at ESPN. He's living in Connecticut. It just makes sense. He's the up and coming guy who happens to be in the area." But what's the process like of getting connected with an NBA franchise? And then I've listened to other interviews where you talked about going through the audition. So showing up and sitting down and doing an audition tape for an NBA job.
Yeah, it was a long process. It was like I would I would compare the process of getting the Celtics job to a 2.5 hour movie where for the first 2 hours and 20 minutes, nothing really happens. And then in the last 10 minutes, there's the climax, and then bang, all this crazy shit happens. And all of a sudden, you've arrived at a happy ending. That's how this process was for me. So I started talking to the NBC Sports Boston people in April. And I know you know this, Joel, but for people who don't, like the Celtics don't sign my paychecks. I'm not a Celtics employee. I'm an NBC Sports Boston employee. Every team is a little bit different, but I think this is a pretty standard protocol. For this job, I'd be hired by NBC Sports Boston, but they would need approval from the actual team. And so we started talking in April because at that point, I don't think they knew Mike's plan necessarily, or maybe they knew it, but they had the idea that they wanted to bring in another play-by-play announcer and sort of start the pass, the passing of the baton from Mike to the next guy. So in April, I started talking to them, and from the jump, I was like, "There's no way this happens. There's no way I get this job. They're going to hire someone who's famous or from Boston or probably both, and I'm none of the above." So
Which I think is
I
something people think about a lot, I think, in this business when they look for jobs.
Yeah, it's like I might as well put my hat in the ring here, but there's no way this happens. And so my agent got me connected with the people from NBC Sports Boston. Had the first interview, thought it went really well, but again, I'm like, no way. Month goes by, they send me an email, "Hey, we'd love to bring you in for a demo. Are you free this date?" I'm like, I literally reply all caps, yes, with like 5 exclamation points. And my agent, Kevin Belby, Syracuse guy, hit me up on the side and was like, "Hey man, glad you're excited, but like Let's act like you've been there before. I'm like, that's a good point. I haven't been here before, but good call. Going for the audition. Scal and I called the Sixers Celtics second round game 6, which was happening live. And the reason we wanted to do a road game was because Scal was in studio. So they do pregame, halftime, and postgame coverage, even when we don't have the game on our air. And after the first round of the playoffs, all the games are national exclusives. So the game wasn't on NBC Sports Boston. This is like really inside baseball. Sorry if it's boring for anybody.
No.
So the game was on TNT or ESPN, whatever it was. We had the studio programming, so Scal was in the studio, right? So that gave him a chance to, during the game, come over into this basically broom closet podcast studio where we taped our audition together. And from the moment I met him, Scal was extremely supportive. And we had a freaking blast doing that audition. And there was one point where I can't remember what happened. I think it was a steal and a transition layup. But Scal actually, instead of analyzing the play, looked across the table at me and was like, that was a great call, man. I'm like, thanks. But I didn't realize we were breaking the fourth wall. Celtics lead by 4, something like that. And so
Which
we had
probably
an awesome
sounded
time.
Great, honestly.
Well, maybe, I hope
Like
so.
in stride, they were like, that was kid's quick.
Yeah, right. Like I don't even remember if that's what I said, but anyway, so we do the audition, thought it went great. Again, didn't expect to get the job. Whole summer goes by, stay in touch with them. Don't think it's going to happen. Then they set up a meeting with the president of the team, Rich Gotham. And I would assume it was him and the owners, Wick Grossbeck and Steve Paliuca, maybe some other people from the front office who had to sign off. And when I met with Rich, I'm like, this is a pretty important, busy guy. Maybe this is going to happen. There can't be that many people who are meeting with him. Thought that went great as well. And, a few weeks later, they offered me the job. But the thing is, I had just re-signed at ESPN full time. And so I wasn't sure if I could do it. But thankfully, my agent is the best in the business, in my opinion. Shout out Syracuse. And the ESPN people were awesome. And they signed off on it. And now I can do both. And it's quite literally, Joel, the dream job. Like people would ask me when I was in school and right after I left school and when I started ESPN, like, what do you want to do? I would always say I'd love to be the voice of a team and still work at a network. And here we are. So I'm just going to try not to blow it.
On that note, if I can go back to one of the very first things you said was your whole career to this point has been, as you would feel, a stroke of luck. Why do you say that? Because I think a lot of people would say, no, you're just really good at what you do at this point in time. But what stars have aligned?
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I just think that at every step of the way, there have been other people opening doors, and at a certain point, you have to walk through them, but you can't if the door is closed. And so, like, going back to when I was in high school, I had a really good journalism teacher, right? And that was the time I decided I wanted to do something along these lines, was Mr. Moats. And I never knew that, talking about sports for a living could be a job until I took his class, basically. And, the classic thing every announcer says is, when I realized I couldn't play sports for a living, I decided to talk about them. And that is true. But it wasn't immediate for me. So I had to have that great journalism teacher who showed us the movie All the President's Men, which is still one of my favorite films and is the reason I drink black coffee, because I saw Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford drinking black coffee and ripping cigs in the office. And I'm like, that's what journalists do. So that's what I'm going to do.
It's good you got the coffee and not the cigarettes.
Yes. Although definitely not on the Zoom call, but after the Zoom, I will have to burn one in my apartment here. Just kidding. So I had a great journalism teacher, got into the best school to do this, Newhouse, which I never thought I'd get in. Like I was a good high school student, but the late, great Dean Branham, rest her soul, when I was on my Newhouse tour, I remember her telling us we have an acceptance rate of 9%. I'm like, oh, I'm out. No
By
chance.
the way, you've been very upfront on some other podcasts I've heard about how the best Newhouse is.
Oh, it's not even close. Like I know you got ties to Ball State, Joel, but I'm sorry. Like there's no doubt. We're talking about we are
Connor
talking
Onions
about
on
the
this
Empire.
podcast next week. If you just want to say it,
Who?
I said Connor Onions on this podcast next week. If you just want to say it, so yeah.
The Onion. I love the Onion. Great guy, but he knows. Everybody knows. It's Syracuse and it's everybody else. Everyone else is playing for second. It's like Larry Bird in the 3-point shootout. So anyway, go to the best school for it. And I think I got in there because, I wrote an essay and had a good interview, like I needed people to take a chance on me, I think. Also, Wes Whiteside in the admissions office is a Vikings fan. And so we talked about Teddy Bridgewater, and I think that's why I got in. I was in the best possible class at Syracuse. In my opinion, like, and I take a lot of pride in this. I hope one day people look back at the class of 2019 and say that's one of the best,
Yeah, it's gonna hold
right?
up. Yeah.
And I was with Noah Eagles, one of my best friends, who's my roommate junior year. Everybody knows what Noah's doing. Tyler Rocky is one of my best friends. We would trudge through the snow at 5 a.m. to WAER. He's crushing it in Chicago, his hometown. James Colgan, Connor Federico, work for golf.com, Dana Gray, Chris Fent. Like, we had a ton of guys in that class. Anthony Mazzini. I don't want to leave anyone out at this point. I shouldn't have named anybody, but you know what I mean? Like,
Oscar speech. Yeah.
yeah, we had all these amazing people in our class, and I feel like we all made each other better. And truly, Joel, like, Noah, I think Noah's leadership and maturity at that age is really the rock of our class. He beat me for every position in Syracuse, and I was pissed in the moment, but I understood it. And in hindsight, I'm glad that he was the sports director at all the radio stations, and I'm glad that he was, the guy everyone was chasing, because Noah was ready for that. And I think a lot of people aren't in college, myself included. I was not mature enough to like make assignments and decide who's going where, but Noah was, and I think that's part of the reason we're all so close still. So that's lucky. And then, I win this award in college, and I sort of feel like that was lucky. Like, I got the opportunities to call so many different sports and work with true professionals when I was a student. Like, Scott Hecht and Kristen Hennessy were the leaders of the show. They were the director and the producer for ACC Network Extra, which, by the way, launched in 2019, my senior year. Luck.
And Scott Heck now like runs broadcasting at the Big East. So we're talking
Yeah,
about really good and did all sorts of crazy, ridiculous NBA and everything else before that.
and Scott and Kristen were both at ESPN before they went to Syracuse. So like, we're working with real pros, and the network launched my senior year. Lucky, got that stuff on my reel, won this award. Luck, that gave me a little bit of juice, I think, in the eyes of my agent, Kevin Belby, who essentially
Met
had
Jim
told me,
Nance.
met Jim Nance, extremely nice guy. I now have a cell phone number. He called me from a restricted number when I won the award, but now I have his cell phone number. Belby, who had told me basically pump the brakes, kid, when I asked him to represent me right out of school. He's like, we don't really represent people who just graduated. Like, let's give it a couple of years, win the award. And then Belby's like, maybe we can work together. And so I've been with him since graduation. That's luck. I did an audition at ESPN after 2 years. By the way, the job in Alabama, like, an amazing first opportunity, and not even the thing I envisioned doing. Because like you said earlier, Joel, I wanted to do play-by-play. It's my favorite thing to do, but I did local news for 2 years, ended up at a station that really emphasized sports, doing the SEC on a CBS station in Birmingham. Like, to me, the best possible market to cover college football in America. That's lucky. Audition at ESPN with an Alabama alum. Roman Harper is the guy who came into the studio to do my studio audition. He was amazing. That's lucky. So like, all these, and then Scal, same thing. I think all those different steps along the way, like, I've just had great fortune, and that's part of the reason why it's important to me to try to help the next generation. Like, all those different strokes of luck, none of that even mentions the fact that I've had amazing mentors. Like, I'm pretty sure I hit you up for a critique when I was in school.
Probably.
Like,
It wasn't a good one, but
it
it sounds great.
guarantee
Keep
this
going.
thing I sent you is not good. That's for sure. Like, there's so many people from Syracuse, part of the reason I say it's the best, who have helped us along the way, reach the places we want to be. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe the reason I say that is because I think for me to say like any success I've had is totally because of me is just totally misses the point. And I think the only reason I've had any success is because of the people who have helped me reach this point. You know what I mean?
Drew, how do people find you if they're a Celtics fan? Obviously, NBC Sports Boston. I know you're still doing the ESPN thing. So
Yeah.
when do they find you next on ESPN? How do they track you down?
Good question. I think my next ESPN assignment is Sports Center, but it's not until mid-February.
Nice.
Um, I did a couple sports centers. The funny thing is, I guess the beautiful irony is I started getting better assignments at ESPN when I got another job. Because it's like at ESPN, if there's another thing you're doing and they think it sort of raises your profile, then all of a sudden like your assignments improve.
Which is fair.
Yeah, it's cool. It's like when you're at the bar and nobody wants to talk to the guy who's sitting by himself, unless they're as handsome as you are, Joel.
Stop
No one
it.
wants to sit. No one wants to talk to that guy. But if there are like four people around you, it's like interesting. What does that guy have? I want to know. I want to know more about him. So I think that's sort of what's happening at ESPN. So anyway, I've gotten the chance to host a couple sports centers, which is a dream
What's
come
the
true.
first time, like as a sports fan, as a kid, everybody wants to say like, well, we all wanted to say coming up next is Sports Center, but what's it like to say this is Sports Center? Or coming up next on Sports Center?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like, again, literally living a dream. Sports Center was the show that sort of made me a sports fan. I tell this story, and I promise this is germane to what we're talking about. But when I was in Alabama, so Talladega Superspeedway is in the Birmingham market. I didn't know anything about NASCAR when I moved down there, aside from the fact that Jimmy Johnson won 7 Cup championships. Only reason I knew that is because the only time they talked about NASCAR on SportsCenter when I was a kid is when Jimmy Johnson won another one. So that's all I knew. And like I was a kid growing up in Minnesota who didn't really like hockey, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, I like hockey now, but I didn't grow up as a hockey fan. I was a basketball, football fan. Why? Because that's what they talked about on SportsCenter. Like that sort of dictated my whole upbringing as a sports fan. I would watch it until I fell asleep and then watch it when I woke up on replay to the point that ESPN, the logo was burned into my TV at home. So to host that is quite literally a dream come true. And I got to do it with Jay Harris, who's like the man, and he was the dude I was sitting next to at the desk. And he has an amazing, amazing This is Sports Center voice. This is Sports Center, brought to you by Domino's. Like, he is amazing at that.
That's amazing. That wasn't that bad yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Drew, thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate you hopping on.
Thank you, Joel. It's great. And if you want to follow me on social media, at Drudel25, Drew DLE25.
Yeah, what's
which
the
I
deal with
probably
that, by
should
the way?
change
Is that
a long time ago.
was that just like you were young?
Yes, I made that in middle school. Drudel was my sister's nickname for me when I was really young. And if you have a bland, generic name, my name is Andrew William Carter. I sound like I should be like the Duchess of Essex, not a play-by-play announcer.
Duke of Essex.
Duke, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, just trying to think of the most royal sounding title possible. But yes, Drew Carter is a pretty boring name, so I had to come up with something, and I've kept it all these years. Drudel25.
Do you have a corgi, by the way, with you right now?
Not with me. He's at my parents' place, but I'm probably going to go see him right after this.
Big corgi guy.
Yeah.
I'm
Are you a big corgi guy?
I'm a poodle guy because they don't shed. But like for the longest time, all I knew about Drew is I was like, I think his name is Drew Weddle, because I always read it wrong on Twitter, and then I was like, and he likes corgis.
Yes.
So.
Or that I'm very happy if that's the main personality trait people know about me. Joel, I like poodles too, but I guess you're just not tough enough to deal with the hair. You're not tough enough.
No, it's I have bad genetics. I sneeze.
Yeah. Well,
tough hit.
Maybe if you grow up a little bit and you can deal with some hair, then you can get a corgi, and they're the best.
Amazing. Drew, thank you, man.
Thanks, buddy.